teachers, for administrators, for central office staff. So to take a little bit of that precious time for us to learn together, I certainly, definitely appreciate it. Knowing all that, too, let's just jump right into the content. You know, I've had the privilege, the honor of being both a site principal trying to lead this process of ensuring that all kids learn, all kids receive what I want for my own child, as well as had the privilege of working with schools and districts throughout this nation. What do we know? We know we live in a day and time where the consequences of success or failure at school have never been greater. And I'm not talking about the draconian consequences of what happens to schools that don't meet AYP and go into program improvement. I'm talking about what happens to children. Right now, if schools are here to prepare children to be adults, and ask any parent why they send their child to school, and they'll tell you it's not about raising test scores, it's about getting their child ready for the adult world someday. Well, then as educators, we need to understand something. And what's that? That 90% of the jobs we're preparing kids for right now will take more than a high school diploma for a chance at the middle class. For those of you that teach elementary that are participating today, we know 40% of the jobs you are preparing kids for don't exist. Don't exist. You teach high school, the graduating class from your high school last year, the average student's going to change careers 4 times by the age of 40. Not jobs, but employers' careers. And why? Because the economy our kids are going to compete in is a global marketplace driven by innovation, technology, and service. And I mention that to you because we need to understand something. Our traditional school system was never designed for all kids to learn. When it started back in the mid-1800s, half of our nation farmed and a third of our nation worked in factories. Certainly noble professions, but by no means professions that took higher levels of success in school to get the position. It just took elbow grease, hard work. Now every kid has to make it, and we need to rethink the way our schools work. Of everything we're about to talk about this day, it's built upon one fundamental assumption, and that's this. There's no way on God's green earth an individual teacher has all the time, all the skills, and all the knowledge to meet the needs of every child assigned to their class or classes, no matter how hard they try. I mean, I bet right now on the campus that you work at, or if you're a principal, the campus that you help lead, the campuses that you support as central or regional or state offices, if kids are struggling, it's not because teachers are not working hard enough or educators are not working hard enough. I bet every day 99% of the staff members that work on a campus work beyond their required hours. And it's not because they don't care enough. It's because our system wasn't designed for all kids to learn. We know all kids don't learn the same way or the same speed. So one teacher alone can't differentiate instruction to a point where they're meeting every instructional need of each child or give every child unlimited time in their class to be able to learn. Here's the good news. The good news is a staff together can. You got the perfect teacher on your campus right now. Not one of you, it's all of you. Combined, you have the teaching styles, curricular knowledge that you need. But you have to get past my kids and your kids and make them our kids. And what we need to do is build systems of interventions that when kids struggle, the school doesn't respond, but instead, the teacher doesn't respond alone. Instead, the school responds in intentional, purposeful, systematic ways. Now, why do I say that? Because that's the purpose of what RTI is. RTI is a research-based program to give every single child the additional time and support they need until they can learn at the highest levels. It's our opposite thinking from traditional special ed when we have a wait-to-fail model where the help didn't come until kids dropped far enough behind. Instead, we shouldn't be delaying help. We should be proactive at the first sign of a child needing help. We should be systematically doing something. Now, when you learn about RTI, the most common shape that people are taught are the pyramid. The idea that at the bottom of the pyramid, Tier 1, represents what all kids need and what all kids get. And yet, we know no matter how well we teach it the first time, some kids won't get it. So the levels of support represent Tier 2, a little help, and Tier 3, a lot of help. And it's systematic so that as the child moves up the system, the interventions become more targeted, more intensive, but fewer kids need it, hence the tapered shape. Now, why do I mention that to you? Because most schools when we work with them or have the privilege to observe why most schools are struggling with RTI, it's this. Most schools, when they think kids are struggling, most of them think, well, it's an intervention problem. We need better interventions. Quite honestly, what we're finding is this. Most schools, the biggest problem is not their interventions. It's they're not building the right conditions and the right structures in place for most kids and for most teachers to succeed in the first place. In other words, it's a Tier 1 problem. Or as we often say, if you have a lot of kids struggling, you don't have an intervention problem. You have a what you're doing all day problem. And interventions don't make up for poor initial teaching. It won't make up for a toxic school culture. It won't make up for teachers that don't work in collaborative teams. It won't make up for teachers or schools that are trying to cover all the curriculum, and there's too much curriculum to cover, so there's not even enough time to teach it once, let alone time to stop and reteach. It won't make up for schools that let state tests be their way of identifying kids for extra help instead of knowing along the way with formative assessments what's going on. And it won't make up for a situation where a school has a culture of my kids and your kids, and we don't see them as our kids. That's not an intervention problem. It's a what and who we are problem. Now, here's what's interesting, too. The research behind RTI says this. Most kids should make it in Tier 1. How many kids? You know, as a general target, 75 to 80% at least. I say at least. If you're at a school where 90% of your kids enter each grade level at or above grade level, then you should shoot for at least 90% of your kids to be learning things after Tier 1. Why? If not, you're not even maintaining what you've inherited, let alone helping kids improve and succeed. But what's interesting with the RTI research is this. They don't really tell you how to make sure most kids get it the first time and most teachers are successful the first time. Basically, the research says most kids should get it the first time, and now here's what you do when kids don't get it. But how do you make sure most kids get it the first time? Well, our very first book, Pyramid Response to Intervention, the basic thesis of it is this. It is collaborative teacher teams that are going to drive your school's intervention efforts. So if you haven't built the right school collaborative culture and collaborative structures, then Tier 1 can't work, and what you do into Tier 2 and Tier 3 can't work either, or won't be effective, no matter how dedicated and how good the intentions are of the hardworking educators on your campus. When we say collaborative teams, we're not talking this past practice we've had too long of teachers not truly working in teams, but kind of coordinated collegial groups. We're talking the structures that have been designed by the professional learning communities at work model. We basically say this: you can't do RTI without PLCs. So with that in mind, let's spend a little bit of time here and let me show you and prove to you how, if we want interventions to work, it starts with Tier 1, and how the fundamental practices of being a professional learning community give us what we need to make most kids and help most kids succeed the first time, and how it will guide when you get into interventions. So let's think about what we ask a collaborative team of teachers to focus on and think about in the collaborative PLC process. We know that we make a commitment that our fundamental mission of our school is learning, that we're not here to teach things, we're here to ensure that kids learn it. We know one teacher can't do it alone, so we have educators work in high-performing teams. We group these teams around what? Teachers who share learning outcomes for their students. So our teacher teams are teachers in which they share content, they share curriculum that are essential learnings related to what we ask that teacher to do all day. The collaboration isn't an additional meeting, it's a meeting each week that's going to help me do my job better in my own classroom and help us serve our collective kids better. So that's a critical point. The teams here, while it's okay to form teams around teachers who share students, it has to be more than just we share students, more than just an interdisciplinary team. We must share learning outcomes, and you'll see why in just a minute. When we form teams around teachers who share learning outcomes, we ask them to ask some critical questions. The first question is what? What do we expect our students to learn? Why do we have them think about that particular question? A lot of people tell us, but Mike, we already have state standards, don't we? Why would we have teachers discuss what they want kids to learn? We already have the state standards. We already have our required curriculum. We have the new Common Core. So really it's teachers' job to teach it. Well, I'll ask you all this question. Would you agree with this statement, that there are more essential state standards than you can ever hope to have every child master? Of course. In fact, Marzano did a study of national standards. Here's what he found. For the average kid to learn them, to cover them all, we'd have to go from a K-12 program to a K-22 program. Unless one of your interventions is the average kid is going to get to go to school until they're 22 or older, they're not going to have access to them all. They're not going to learn them all, not going to master them all. So it's not your teachers don't know how to group and design the curriculum. It is impossible. Now, I want you to think about the unintended consequences of ever since No Child Left Behind passed, states are required to have a guaranteed curriculum for each student, but it hasn't been viable. It hasn't been a doable amount of curriculum. We've been telling teachers you have to cover it all. So what happens is they look at how much curriculum there is, and they realize there's no way that we could teach it all. So what they end up doing is this. In the privacy of their own room, when the standards police aren't watching, they're making choices. They're saying, hey, I think this is pretty darn important. I'm going to make sure that I hit this hard. I might even find time to reteach it. This year, I'm going to get to, I'll make sure all kids have exposure to it. I probably won't have time to teach it more than once. And this year, I might get to it at the end of the year. I might not. Well, every teacher is doing this in the privacy of their own room. So what does that mean? 3 national studies of the actual curriculum, not what's on your district guide, not what's on your state standards guides or books, what's actually being taught. Here are words to describe it. A self-selected jumble of standards. Wild variation from teacher to teacher, same course, same subject, same school on what a child might learn. And a national study of the language arts standards called it curricular chaos. We must bring this process out into the light of day. Why? How can we begin to guarantee all kids access to core instruction in Tier 1? And how can we begin to share kids for Tier 2 and Tier 3 and respond collectively if we haven't agreed on the first place on what students have to learn? And how can we find time to give kids supplemental and intensive support and not have them miss core instruction if we're not even clear what's essential in core instruction in the first place? Because when everything's essential, nothing is. So if we brought this process out into the light of day, not saying we toss out the new Common Core, not saying we're tossing out your district or state standards, what important resources to pull from that experts have helped create. But it's not the end-all, be-all, and it's not the perfect document when it comes to the amount of curriculum that's in there. So teams of teachers within a school and or district that teach the same course would come together, not to dictate in some rigid pacing guide what every teacher must cover, but to have critical conversations of all the content and what are those essential things. Would you agree? In our curriculum, there are nice to know things and there are got to know things. There are things if a child learns it this year or doesn't, it won't kill them next year. That's nice to know. But there are some things if a child doesn't get this year, their chance of success next year and beyond has just been compromised. They've got to learn it this year. Well, we haven't identified what that is. How do you know what to focus on for interventions? And how do we collectively respond if we identified those things, but each teacher did it in isolation and came up with different conclusions? So that means they're all teaching different essential things to different levels of rigor at different times. That would make the intervention process virtually impossible, okay? I want you to turn to the person next to you because many of you I saw are together. Take just a quick minute here and chat about this question, or if you are listening to this long, think about your response to this question. That is, have you clearly identified what it is that's essential by course, grade level, and subject that a student must learn in each course, grade level for a student to be properly prepared for next year? Think about that for just a quick minute. Ready? Go. Okay. Let's bring it on back here in 5 and 4, 3 and 2, 1, and thank you. Now, I just posted in the chat box a personal web page that I have. Let me share with you a tool that can help your teachers in this critical conversation. So I want to stress a key point here. The idea of identifying essential standards, it's not the making of a list of standards. It's a process, and it's critical that every single teacher and educator in your building have the opportunity to be part of this process, because the process itself improves core instruction. When I say it's not a list, what we found is this. When a lot of schools start the PLC process and ask teacher teams that first critical question, what do we expect kids to learn? Usually the product that ends up being produced is a team of teachers will take their state standards, they'll read them off one at a time, they'll say, hey, do we think this is essential? And if everyone gives a thumbs up, then they highlight it, and they get done with a highlighted list at the end of, here are the things that we think are essential. Well, having led the process with some phenomenal educators as a principal, we found that, that's how we started the first time. It wasn't a deep enough conversation. What kind of conversation do we need to have? What depth do we need to get into on identifying essential standards? Well, the tool that you have up on screen right there is actually a tool that's in both of our books. It's probably the most requested single tool that comes from our books, because it helps the team have the right depth of conversation. What do I mean by that? Well, here's problem number one. Have you ever found that the educational ease that standards are written in could be confusing and up to interpretations sometimes? A lot of teachers do. And so what ends up happening is teachers will identify an essential standard and assume they all define it the same way, but it turns out they don't. But again, it was an assumption. They go back to their room and they teach the standard, but it's really not the same standard. Take a look at the left-hand column of that chart that's up. It says description of standard. When teachers identify an essential standard, the first thing they do is they rewrite it in their own words. They put it in simple, understandable words to make sure everyone on the team agrees to what the standard means. And they do it for them to guide their teaching. But if they did it for them, but it's in simpler words, who else can they share it with? The students and the parents, exactly right. So they can have access to what those targets are in words that they can understand. Second column from the left says example rigor. What will it look like if a child's proficient? You can't just agree upon the standard. Get this. In the state of California, the standard for persuasive writing is written the exact same way, word for word, for 7 consecutive years, from upper elementary all the way through high school. Do you think what we expect of a student in showing proficiency of persuasive writing changes from 5th grade to 12th grade? Of course. Just agreeing upon the standard isn't enough. What will a student be able to know or do? Next column over, prerequisite skills. This will change your interventions forever. The idea is this. What prior skills and knowledge do you need to be able to learn the new skill? Why is that so important? Because, get this, an important point here, the best intervention is prevention. The best intervention is prevention. Or as my dear co-author, Dr. Chris Weber, says it, if it's predictable, it's preventable. If we know there are skills that a child lacks from prior years of learning that they have to know to learn a new skill, we can screen for that skill before we start initial instruction and start to provide preventive help so kids can succeed in Tier 1 in the first place. The other powerful part of that column on prerequisite skills is this. Let us say we're an Algebra 1 team. We've identified the essential standards for Algebra 1 and the prerequisite skills needed. Well, who can they share that column with? Well, how about the pre-algebra team to see if the essential standards they've identified match the skills that the algebra team thinks kids are going to walk in with? That starts a vertical articulation conversation across our school. Next column, when taught. If it's important enough for all kids to learn it, then let's lay out to teach the essentials at about the same time. Not a rigid pacing guide, but how can we share kids and respond collectively if you identify an essential standard and one teacher wants to teach in September and someone else in February? Can't. The essentials must be taught at about the same time. A curricular map to lay those out in a logical sequence. Next column, common substantive assessment. If it's important enough for all kids to learn, we're going to assess it the same way. And here's a key point. We identify the assessment up front. That way we know what format we want kids to practice the information in while we're teaching it. Because it's really not fair to talk about things in class and throw kids an essay question on the same content at the end of the unit. Why? Writing about something is harder than talking about something. So if we haven't identified the assessment, we don't know the format we want to have kids practice it in at some point during instruction. Then last column, extension standard. That means this. A lot of schools ask us, Mike, what do we do during our intervention time for kids who've already gotten it while we're helping kids who haven't gotten it yet? Well, great question. Plan ahead. Every time you teach something, some kids won't get it the first time, some kids will. If it's essential, the kids who didn't get it have to be able to get it. They'll need extra help. But if they've already gotten it, what if we already thought about those nice-to-know standards that if a child doesn't get it, it won't kill them next year, but if a child's ready for it, why wouldn't we? Imagine for a second what it would do for your teachers and your Tier 1 instruction and targeting your interventions if you had that level of clarity right now by course, grade level, and subject by semester what a child must learn. What would it do for you? It would guide your collaborative teams. They can't talk about every standard in their weekly collaborative time, so it would guide their collaboration. It would guide their common assessments. Common assessments take work. You can't do it on everything. It would what? It would enable them to be able to maybe de-emphasize some things in the curriculum, to have some time to actually teach and reteach, time for interventions. It would guide your interventions. You have limited intervention resources, don't you? You can't reteach everything. This will help guide. It would help next year's teachers. They would know no matter what teacher a kid had last year, I know what they'll walk in with. It would help you know what students have to get in Tier 1 and what students can miss in Tier 1 if they're intensely behind and need supplemental help, but you don't want to replace their core curriculum with remedial coursework, because if not, those kids never catch up. Gives you like a roadmap for the entire year. And who are we saying should have a strong voice in this? Well, the teachers who are going to teach it, that's why. For two reasons. If a teacher is part of a conversation with colleagues to the depth of the conversation on this chart, do you think they'll teach it better? Of course they will. They'll know that standard inside out and backwards. On top of that, if they help create it, what's the likelihood they'll teach it? Really high. The likelihood they'll assess it? Really high. The likelihood they'll care deeply when kids don't get it? Really high. People often tell me, Mike, we can't get people to buy into RTI. It's not the word buy-in. No, it's not. I hate that phrase. It sounds like a Texas Hold'em tournament or something. Worse than that, it's the wrong connotation for teachers. Are you telling me that if RTI is here to help all kids learn, teachers are saying what? What's in it for me? We attract people to this profession who go through at least one extra year of college to make less money. Yeah, I mean, if people don't join this profession for what they can get, it's for what they can give. If you hear your staff telling you we can't get buy-in, what they're saying is this: I don't own it. Ownership's the word. So if we empower our staff to be able to have ownership of this process, not sole ownership, but a strong voice in it, then what we end up doing is we've increased the chances they'll actually be taught and assessed and intervened when kids don't get it. Turn to the person next to you. Really quick question. Now, I asked you earlier, have you identified what all kids must learn? Let me go one step deeper. Have you identified what kids must learn to the level you see on that chart? Because if you haven't, there's room to improve. There's a target and a way for you to dig deeper, okay? And again, this activity is downloadable on my webpage as well as on the solution tree page on the pages tied to our two books, okay? Quick conversation on that. That's our first critical outcome in Tier 1. I'll talk about the second essential element. Go. Okay, I'm going to bring you on back here in 5 and 4, 3 and 2, 1, and thank you. So we're talking about essential elements of core instruction. Step 1 is we better get laser-like clear on what we want kids to learn. Of all the years that the respected researcher Robert Marzano has studied effective schools, you want to know his number one thing to improve learning? He calls it a guaranteed viable curriculum. Guaranteed. Doesn't matter what teacher I have for this course or grade level or subject, I'm guaranteed to have access to these learning outcomes. But viable, too. It's a doable amount of curriculum. ELC process, when done properly, it makes it possible when we answer question 1 to provide every child that within our school. Greatest leverage point to help kids learn. The second question we ask a PLC to think about, a PLC team, is how do we know kids have learned it? Can we agree right now you cannot wait for your state test results to guide interventions? Why? That test doesn't measure everything essential. Even if it did, it doesn't measure it well. And even if it measured everything perfectly, guess what? When do you get the results? End of the year next year. What's happened to the kids who haven't made it? They're gone or another year farther behind. We can't wait that long. We have to know along the way. Well, if we're talking about knowing if kids have learned, we'll obviously talk about assessment. There's one area in education we are creating a beast that cannot be fed. It's the area of assessment. Why? We're making it too hard, too complicated, and especially in RTI, where we have extra layers of assessment with universal screen and progress monitoring. You do that wrong, you will bury your teachers in so much assessment. This is what they'll tell you. I have no time to teach anymore. All I do is assess. Now, I think any good educator knows good assessment is part of good teaching. But too much assessment takes away from our ability to provide direct instruction. So if that's the case, here's the key thing. Assessment is just a way to help you know where you're at to guide where you're going to go next. It'll help you know from your initial teaching in Tier 1 what you need to do for interventions in Tier 2. So let's ask this question. If assessment is just to guide what you're going to do, what do you need to know to guide interventions? From Tier 1 instruction to interventions at Tier 2, what do you need to know to have effective interventions? Here's the key thing. You ready? Two things. 1, you have to know which kids learned it and which kids didn't. Which kids mastered the skills and which didn't. That just makes sense, right? How do you identify kids from Tier 1 instruction to extra help if you're not clear in the first place what kids should have learned, right? Or who learned it, who learned it and who didn't. But there's a key word in there. I made it red, specific. Here's the key point, you ready? You got to get down to by the kid, by the standard. By the kid, by the standard. Too many schools have interventions that in our book we call the buckshot approach. You're hunting with a shotgun. We group kids by big, broad indicators, things like this. The following kids scored below proficient on last year's state test in math. We'll all give them 2 periods of math for an intervention this year. That's misguided. Why? Do you think they all failed the state math test for the same reason? All have the same needs? What if my problem was chronic absenteeism? Fine, I'll miss twice as much math next year. Not good enough. In math, they have all sorts of different holes in math skills. So what does a teacher reteach? Now, what if I told you this? The following students are struggling with multiplying exponents. Math teachers out there, would you know what to reteach? Totally. How about this? We will group kids at the elementary school in a reading by their universal screening score. A lot of schools use a quick basic reading assessment to get a baseline on their students to start the school year, a short test like maybe Dibbles. Well, how about this? What if I told you 7 third graders do not know, seven third graders took Dibbles and they're in the red intensive zone, significantly below grade level. Tell me what you're going to reteach them if you put them in the same reading group. Don't know, do you? Why? Just because they're all in the red zone and Dibbles doesn't mean they all have the same reading need. That's why you spend so much time on the last part that we talked about, identifying essential standards. If you're not clear what you want kids to learn in the first place, how do you assess it? By the standard. That's only half of what you need. What's the other thing that you need to know? Which instructional practices worked and which ones didn't? Why? Here's a key point. You want your interventions to work? More of the same is rarely the answer. More of the same is rarely the answer. Giving kids more of what didn't work the first time is pretty much never the right intervention. Why? Because if it would have worked the first time, it would have worked the first time. More of the same is the answer. We do it all the time. Why? Not because we're stupid and not because we don't care, because most teachers work in isolation. If I told you, if you're a teacher and I told you, you identified an essential standard, and everyone who teaches that subject at your school taught it, and you give a common, the same assessment at the end, and you grade your assessments for the kids in your class, and I told you 85% of the kids in your class passed it. Is that good or bad? 85%. What if I told you that you compared results with your teammates who taught the same kinds of kids at your school, and 95% of their kids passed? What if I told you it was 65% in their class? You notice the 85 didn't move. You went from feeling bad to good. Why? Numbers are just numbers. Until what? Teachers get a point of comparison. That's what makes numbers relevant. John Hattie, in his book, Visible Learning, the most comprehensive study of what works in schools in the history of mankind, says this: teachers reflecting on evidence of student learning in isolation, there's no evidence to suggest that they'll improve teaching or learning. Why? You don't know if the way you taught it was effective without a point of comparison. And two, even if your results are poor and you can figure that out without a point of comparison, what better way do you have to reteach it? Why? Teachers teach the best they know how every day. I mean, they don't ever plan a unit and think like this. You know, I might need to reteach this for intervention, so I think I'll start with my kind of good instructional practices. I'll save my really good ones for later. Never. So if I teach the best I know how the first time as a teacher and some kids don't get it, what better way do I have to reteach it? I don't. So if I stop and reteach, I'll probably just speak louder and slower to a smaller group of kids. And unless they're hard of hearing, that's probably not what they need. So the key thing is this: we need to compare results in core instruction to see what instructional practices worked and which ones didn't. Let me make this as clear as I possibly can. You need to know two things to guide interventions. One, which kids learned it, which kids didn't. Two, what worked and what didn't in your initial teaching. Because if you can tell me which kids need what by the kid and by the standard, and what is the best way to reteach it, that makes the crosshairs to hit the intervention target. I got what I need. If I take away any one of those things, I can't hit the target. I can tell you the best way to reteach it, but if I don't know which kids learned it and which kids didn't, I don't know who do I identify for intervention. If I know which kids did and which kids don't, but I don't know what worked and what didn't in Tier 1, I'll give kids more of what didn't work. This is what PLC teams do. This is the PLC process in action when they're doing it right. So let me ask you this question. Do you know right now if your collaborative teacher teams are having conversations in which they are identifying by the kid, by the standard, who learned it and who didn't? And more importantly, are they comparing results to see what's working, what's not in their initial instruction? Why do I say that? Because all of the country, we see schools that claim to be a PLC, but do you want to know where they're stopping the process? At that comparison point. Why? It's scary. It makes teachers vulnerable. Until they start to do it and build trust with their colleagues, it's awkward. And so they stop there. But the catch is, if you don't compare results, you can't improve instruction because you don't know what's working and what's not. And if you don't improve instruction, don't expect your interventions to work. This is the critical tipping point that's going to connect Tier 1 to Tier 2. So take a quick minute. Do you know if your teachers are doing that now? If you're an administrator, if you're a teacher listening, are you having frequent conversations with your colleagues like that? Because that's the way we improve instruction. Take a quick minute and talk about that. Ready? Go. Okay, we've got about 6 minutes left here until we open up for questions, and I have a really important one last piece that I want to teach you here, okay? So a lot of schools contact us and they say, well, if we want to improve Tier 1, Mike, what we need to do is just get teachers to differentiate better in their own classroom. If we could just get teachers to differentiate better. I'm not saying that's not worthwhile, but it's not our greatest leverage point if we want to improve Tier 1 instruction, by trying to get each teacher to coach them into teaching more effectively each day. The key thing is this. You have more leverage point if you have collaborative teams of teachers working to improve instruction together for their kids, instead of trying to get each individual teacher to somehow coach themselves into better teaching for their particular students. How do we do that? Well, we've talked about most of it so far. We carve out time for collaboration. We put teachers in teams where they share learning outcomes. We have those teachers get really clear on what they want kids to learn. And then as they teach those essentials, they are stopping and giving common assessments, both to identify which kids got it and which kids didn't, and to compare results to improve instruction. But we thought long and hard about, since our first book, on how do we give some very doable and practical ways for schools to improve Tier 1. And we've leaned very heavily on the research of both Rick Stiggins and Robert Marzano and tried to take some of their most powerful recommendations and turn it into a simple, doable process that any teacher team at any grade level, from kindergarten to AP calculus, could use and start to have dramatic improvements in Tier 1 instruction. And let me show you how it works. We call it a teaching cycle. You know, what if I told you there are 3 things you can have every team commit to that can have a profound difference in core instruction, Tier 1 instruction? Wouldn't that be worth your while? Well, let me show you what those 3 things are, okay? I want you to think the way teachers have traditionally planned a unit of study. An individual teacher, work in isolation, usually sat down before they start a new unit, and they thought, what do I have to teach? Not what do kids have to learn, what do I have to teach? What do I have to cover? I mean, shoot, I taught U.S. history for almost 15 years. That's what I did. In the privacy of my own room, during my prep time or at home, I laid out units. I think about what I had to cover. I lay it out in kind of a unit plan. I'd start teaching it. Then towards the end of the unit, I would think, man, I better think about the way I'll assess this. So I would create or identify an assessment, or I might take part of the book series questions and part of my own. I'd put them together. And then what? I'd assess those kids. Some kids got it, some kids didn't, and I would move on. That's that focus on a teaching to create a great bell-shaped curve. Now, in the PLC process, what we're asking teachers to do is this. In a collaborative team, before you teach the unit, sit down and not ask, what do I need to cover, but what do what? Kids have to learn. Focus on learning. And we'll identify those essential learning outcomes for this unit. And before we teach the unit, let's ask the second question. How do we know if kids have learned it? So we're entering the unit already thinking about the end in mind. But then each teacher is going to lay out how they teach it throughout the unit, which is fine. Then at the end of the unit, we ask the question, how do we know if kids have learned it? We give that common summative assessment. Some kids get it, some kids don't. But since our mission is learning, that's how we identify kids for Tier 2. But here's the question. What if a bunch of kids aren't getting it in Tier 1? How could you improve it so most kids get it and you don't overwhelm your intervention system? 3 simple recommendations that can have a profound impact. What are they? Ready? Here is advice number 1. Determine what you want kids to learn before you teach the unit, and most importantly, show the kids the learning targets. This is one of the most powerful tools that Rick Stiggins recommends. He says any kid can hit any learning target. Step 1, show them the target. Make sure they know what we want of them. The average teacher was a very good student. I want you to think back when you were in school. How often in middle school, high school, and college were you asked to study for an end of unit exam, and honestly you had no idea for sure what was going to be on that test or not? I mean, isn't that crazy? We're going to hold you accountable for learning, but what we want you to learn is a mystery. You need to guess what I want of you. Crazy. Show the kids the target before you teach the unit. So a team of teachers would sit down and think, what are the essential learnings, and how will we make sure we introduce those learning outcomes to our students up front? That's tip number 1. Tip number 2, plan one common form of assessment during the unit. You've already thought about your summative assessment, the one you'll measure at the end to see if kids have mastered it, but plan one time in a logical place during the unit to be able to see if kids are getting it along the way. You might sit down and talk about where's that point that often trips up kids on this particular concept, or where are we moving past the knowledge and comprehension introduction, we're ready to move on to more application. Let's see if kids are just understanding the basic facts in the first place before we go to that deeper level of rigor. Well, let's plan. So we might say, okay, we're about to teach figurative language to our students. The new Common Core says it's not just you know what figurative language is, can you assess it and evaluate it in a piece of writing. So that team might say, okay, let's share with the kids the rigor level and the outcomes up front. But then let's think. We still need to start by teaching what a simile, what a metaphor is, what figurative language is. How long should that take? Oh, about the first week. How about on the first Friday we plan a quick quiz? 10 questions, 10 pieces of literature. Some are similes, some are metaphors, some are none of the above. And we'll give that quick quiz to see if kids are with us. Okay? So that's tip number 2. We'll give one form of assessment. Then finally, tip number 3, before you teach the unit, plan one blank day in your unit plan to analyze those common assessment results and reteach based upon the results of that assessment. So you might say, hey, we're going to give that common form of assessment the first Friday. So in our unit plans, let's think about it. Our weekly collaboration for our team is every Wednesday. So if we give the test on Friday, teachers have till Wednesday to grade it for their classes. And then on Wednesday's team meeting, we're going to get together and what? Look at those results to see which kids are getting and which kids aren't. Let's compare results to see what's working, what's not in our teaching. So the Thursday after that Wednesday team meeting, we're just going to put blank in our lesson plan. We don't know what we're going to do with that day until what? We compare results on that formative assessment. Then use that blank day to reteach. Dylan Williams often says this. He says, we teach units like we plan every kid to get it the first time. We should plan it like we don't expect kids to get it. Teachers, have you ever taught anything the first time and every kid got it the first time? Never. I taught 15 years. Never happened to me. So let's plan in Tier 1 a little bit of blank time that we will use based upon how kids are doing. Then we'll what? Go on and teach the rest of the unit. What's the power of that? What we're trying to do is this. If you're functioning as a PLC team right now, it's not something different. It's just those last 2 critical questions. How do we know kids have learned it, and how will we respond when kids don't learn? Can we stop waiting till the end of the unit to ask the last 2 questions and instead move it into the unit? What if in the unit we measured if kids are getting it and started to put some flexible time to reteach? What would happen? More kids would get it during the unit, so by the time the end of the unit came, more kids got it. That means fewer kids need Tier 2. That means you won't overwhelm your intervention system. So think about 3 simple things. Show the kids the targets, plan one common formative assessment. It has to be common so we can compare results during the unit. Put one blank day in the unit to reteach. Now, teens have asked us, Mike, could we do that cycle more than once, maybe a couple of common assessments during the unit? Absolutely. But we'd be thrilled if every teen did it just once. Just that would profoundly impact Tier 1, which would make your interventions all the stronger when you're having most kids get it the first time. Now, my webinar next week, now we've strengthened Tier 1. Let's talk about how we can make effective Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions happen. I'll get a bit clearer on the role of collaborative teacher teams in Tier 2 and Tier 3, as well as how we start to structure and think the way our school-wide resources are used at Tier 2 and Tier 3 to help all kids get it. Carol, I'll turn things over to you for any questions.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate all the great information on effective core instruction, and I'm sure our listeners do too. I always learn so much from you. We're ready now for some questions, and the first question we have is one that we hear frequently, and that is, how often should our collaborative teams meet?
Great question. Certainly, I've never seen teams do this work effectively in less than weekly collaboration. And how long should those meetings be? At least 45 minutes. Longer is greater, but I've seen highly effective teams, well-focused, good norms and protocols, be very effective in about a 45-minute meeting. But if it's farther apart than that, even with bigger chunks of time, like I've seen schools say, well, we'll do a whole planning day once a month. Well, think about how much curriculum goes on from month to month. If you don't catch up until a month later, that means kids have failed for almost a month till we start to do the kinds of things necessary to respond. So weekly, about 45 minutes would be a minimum kind of point.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, if you have a collaborative team that's meeting and they are constantly having conversations like, well, this teacher has the gifted and talented kids, so we can't compare our results with hers, and I have all the low English language learners, so I can't compare. How do we move the conversation away from that point?
Very good. Well, I think the most logical answer to that is I'd ask, why are you making it so that one teacher gets all the high kids and one teacher gets, I've been an elementary and a secondary school principal. I've seen situations where at a grade level, one teacher gets all the above grade level, one gets all the at grade level, one gets all the below grade level. Often the thinking is, well, that teacher can differentiate. What honestly ends up happening is glorified tracking. The high kids stay high, the middle kids stay in the middle, the low kids stay low. We have a saying, if you want kids to learn at high levels, they have to be taught at high levels. You can't learn what you're not taught. And if we want all kids to learn at high levels, all kids should have access to it. You say, well, what if we have teachers who are special trained to work with certain kinds of kids? Maybe the teacher has extra training in EL or in, well, make that flexible time, but don't make it that teacher's class all day. That's not fair. We see secondary schedules where some teachers teach AP all day and some take college prep and remedial all day. Well, what ends up happening is, one, you can't compare results because it's not apples to apples, but two, it's really hard to build a culture where let's share kids when people don't want to share kids. Why? If I'm a teacher and I think, hey, I paid my dues, I had the lowest kids, I worked hard to get this schedule, so I don't want your kids. I want to keep all my kids. Well, that certainly is reinforced when you have and have-not teachers. So two things that we did at two schools that I was principal at the elementary school level, first 2 hours of school was our literacy block. The first hour, all kids had access to grade level curriculum, and kids were in heterogeneous groups. That was the teacher's regular class, different needs. Second hour was what? We grouped kids by instructional reading level. Which teacher at each grade level took the lowest reading group? Well, of course, the teacher with the greatest training and expertise in the teaching of reading. But that wasn't their class all day. It was for this chunk of time. That makes sense. High school, first thing that we did was no one teacher taught all the upper sections, and some teachers taught all the college prep. So I think we attack it first by, can we make some fairness for kids and their fellow colleagues on how we create assignments? Then, even after that, we can still build flexible time in where, let's say you say, well, I have a teacher especially trained in EL for kids who are brand new to the country. That is their core class all day because these kids need really specialized training. Fine, but you can still build supplemental time in your master schedule where we can share kids across teachers to provide Tier 2 supplemental help. And that starts to create that apples-to-apples comparison, too. So great question.
Okay, Mike, another question is it good to take out the children from a classroom to have an intervention in the class in which they have a problem? So in other words, is it good to pull kids out for interventions?
Great question. This will be a key point that I will go deeper into at the beginning of the webinar next week. Here's the key thing. If someone asks me, Mike, what do all kids need at Tier 1? Here's the key thing. Access to essential grade level standards. Essential grade level standards. I didn't say you could never pull them from core instruction. Why? If you never pull them from core instruction, you can't pull them from anything. And some kids are behind in skills. Some kids are years behind in skills. They're going to have to miss something to get caught up. They won't learn those prior skills by osmosis. But What you don't want to do is have them what? Miss essentials to get caught up on prior essentials. You ask any teacher, why do you hate when kids are pulled out of your class? They'll say the same thing, because kids miss stuff. If you pull me out to work on a prior skill, but I miss the next essential, that's one step forward and one step back. So here's the key thing. Go back to that essential standards chart that I taught. If you haven't identified what's essential in your core curriculum, you don't know what kids can miss and what kids can't. Then you don't know where kids can get intervention help and when they can't. That's the benefit of identifying what's essential by course, grade level, and subject. That also is going to guide your Tier 1 instruction to say, if we're about to teach essential learnings, what you must learn this year to succeed next year, kids don't miss that. They're not pulled from core instruction there for extra help. But if we're teaching nice-to-know things that if a child doesn't get it this year, it won't kill him, that starts to make sense. The other thing, too, we'll talk about next week also is carving out intentional time in our master schedule where teachers make a commitment. We're not going to teach new essentials during this time. This is our supplemental intervention time in our master schedule where we can regroup kids and either reteach or enrich depending upon what kids need.
Okay, thank you. Mike, we've got about time for two more questions. The first one is, what if our essential standards or our curriculum is at too difficult of a level for all of our kids? What do we need to do?
Well, I'll be very candid here. I remember when the state of California passed a law a few years back that said all students in 8th grade must take an Algebra 1 course. And I was a middle school principal at that time, and we all kind of melted down saying, these kids can't do it. And we looked at each other and said, well, we don't have a choice. They have to take it, so we can decide they can't do it, or we can figure out what kinds of supplemental intensive supports can we put in place for kids to get it. And we know kids are going to walk in with missing prior skills. So they don't either need access to essential grade level rigor or remediation. They need both. So how can we provide both? We started doing that. Guess what? Our school went from about 58% of our kids passing the Algebra 1 test, and that was only our top kids, because about a third of our kids took it, to within 5 years, over 95% of our kids passing that Algebra 1 test. And that was all the kids in our school, including half the students that we usually weren't in algebra. You think our pass rate would go down if we had kids who in the past weren't in the course move into it. We had the opposite happen. Those kids moved in and our pass rate went up. Why? Because it's amazing how kids will adjust to what we expect of them. Now, whoever asked that question too, you might say, but Mike, I teach 5th grade and I have a child at a pre-primer level. Or I teach high school, I have a child reading at a 3rd grade level. How can they succeed in my class without those skills? Well, let me ask you this question. I know that at the high school level, often a skill that we would teach in reading is the skill of inference. Can a child learn to infer who can't read at grade level? Sure they can. We can read a short story together. We can do some things where they can have access to the information. But if you pull that child out and put them in a remedial reading program, you say, well, let's help them where they're at, and it replaces their access to grade level curriculum, yes, you'll catch them up in remedial reading skills. Well, they drop behind on everything that's rigorous at grade level. So, I mean, honestly, if we start with the assumption every kid's capable, and some kids will walk in behind, some kids will need more time, some kids will learn differently, but they are capable. They're born with the same capacity. If we meet their individual learning needs, then we have a much better chance of getting all kids there than to walk in and say, well, a lot of our kids enter behind, so how can we lower the expectations for them to meet them where they're at? Those kids will never catch up if that is our mindset from the very beginning.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
And I'll add one more piece of that too. Guys, I'm a practitioner, 25 years on site. So when I say it can be done, it's being done, this isn't from me working in a college professor's office talking about, a random group of study group. This is, I've lived it. And I've been the teacher in the classroom who I thought, how can I meet all children's needs, and especially when they enter so far behind? And I couldn't. But when we started to take collective ownership and have systems of support that didn't replace core instruction but but came in addition to. It's amazing how the kids that we thought couldn't make it before could if we started to provide core and more instead of replacing core instruction with remedial tracks of learning.
Thank you. Our last question is from a listener who has really enjoyed the webinar but wants to know where they can go to learn more about response to intervention.
Oh, thank you. Well, specifically about the recommendations that we make, because my two co-authors and I, all three of us are practitioners, and we have tremendous respect for some of the researchers out there that's done significant chunks of research, but sometimes research doesn't show you how to do it in a real-life setting with the true limited resources that most schools have and size of classrooms. And our recommendations really come from taking that research and saying, now, how can we make it practical and doable within the real-life world of a public school classroom and school? So that being said, Solution Tree has been kind enough since our first book's the best-selling intervention book in America. Our second book is already a top seller at Solution Tree. They have helped us create a few PD opportunities. We have some 2-day workshops where we limit the size to about 100 people, and teachers groups come in teams, schools come in teams, and it's 2 days of intensive learning about what I've taught here. We also have 4 different institutes starting from next month through next October throughout the U.S. That's a 3-day institute where people can dig deeper into these processes, and the institutes are built around individuals coming or teams, and their breakouts that are tied to roles. So there's a central office, if you're central or county or district administration, how do you lead and support this process? There are breakouts for that. We have assessment expert Janet Malone working with us. She does breakouts to go deeper into the assessment piece, unpacking standards, learning targets. Award-winning elementary school principal Chris Weber leads things that are really tied to the elementary school intervention process, and I take the lead on most of the secondary pieces. But there are a few ways if someone wanted to dig a little bit deeper beyond just the book and the resources provided there, but actually hands-on learning, a few opportunities there. Whoever asked that question, thank you.
If you all would like more information about anything that Mike has talked about, or to register for any of our events, including Part 2 in this webinar series, feel free to visit solution-tree.com or call 800-733-6786. We really appreciate our audience today. Thank you for participating, and thanks, Mike, for your great presentation.
Thank y'all. I hope to see people coming back next week.